Richard and Mary L. Gray Center for Arts and Inquiry here at the University of Chicago. It's a delight to welcome you to this event and to hand the podium over to Rebecca and Daniel. It is the purpose of the Gray Center for Arts and Inquiry to offer an experimental space for collaborations between artists and scholars. Ideally, collaborations that are transformative for the practices of both and that ramify beyond the confines of the university into the community and beyond. Never the Same seems like an exemplary kind of experiment along those lines. I'll leave it to Daniel and Rebecca to introduce its particular aspirations, but in the meantime, welcome to all of you. It's great to see you all here, and it's really a pleasure to see this project, long in the making, coming to this particular fruition.
Okay, so I'm Rebecca Zorach, and I teach art history here at the university, and with Daniel Tucker, I'm one of the collaborators on Never the Same, which I'll say, so I'm just going to say a little bit about Never the Same, because Daniel will introduce it more fully during the Unfurling, which is the middle portion of our afternoon. First, I just wanted to say, to give a few thanks. I wanted to thank the Gray Center, including David Levin, Leslie Danzig, and Mike Schuh, the Mellon Foundation, which supports the fellowship program, and then the Never the Same staff, Skylar Hearn, Madeline Boucher, and Emma Saperstein. Also, we have a number of people who, over the past couple of years, have done transcription and video editing for us, so I won't call them out by name, but thanks to them too. And to various advisors and supporters, some of whom are here in the audience today. We've really benefited from the wisdom and experience of, and just insights of a lot of people. So it's very much this has been very much a collaborative project beyond simply the collaboration between me and Daniel. So Never the Same, you actually can pick up a coaster with the chair by the door on your way out. Never the Same, conversations about art transforming politics and community in Chicago and beyond. You can also pick out this wonderful booklet from Hull House, which is about, it's called Don't Throw It Away, and it's about documenting and preserving organizational history. So this is a really wonderful resource. And as I told Lisa Johnson who brought them, I think they'll all go today. I think that people really want this. But what I want to say about Never the Same is just that it has kind of a twofold character. It's a series of interviews that we've done with artists in Chicago or outside Chicago, but who have spent a substantial amount of time in Chicago, whose work is politically or socially engaged, and other people who might not necessarily identify as artists, but whose work touches on the arts, or we think is creative in such a way that it has a really important relevance to the arts. So it's a series of interviews which are up as we do them and have them transcribed. They appear on the website in text form, some of them also with a short video clip. So that's one sort of archive that's part of our project. And then the other is a kind of accumulation of materials that came from our own sort of personal collections of ephemera, and also have been growing as other people have given us material, sometimes growing out of interviews. So sometimes when we interview someone, they'll hand over some materials, sometimes just donations that people give us because they want them to be preserved in this archive, where they'll have interesting kind of cross-pollination with the other materials that are in the archive. And these are often things, as I said, ephemera, things like, and we'll see many of them in the Unfurling later today, and we'll also explain what an unfurling is. But it's a kind of show and tell of the archive, of materials from the archive. And so there are things like zines and postcards and posters, event flyers, different kinds of media. We have a range of different media included, and we're kind of in the process of trying to figure out how to organize them, how to make them available to people who might want to use them. And so, because we had a lot of questions, and neither of us is an archivist, we wanted to bring in not only Skylar Hearn, who's a professional archivist who's working with us closely, but also other people who've had experiences with independent, grassroots, community-based archives to kind of learn lessons from their experiences. And that really formed the basis of this conference and of bringing people here from around North America and also from other projects in Chicago to talk about what are some of the challenges, what are some of the opportunities, why do this, how to do it, that kind of thing. So I wanted to start by posing a few questions briefly. And one of them is just why do this? Why grassroots archives, independent, community-based archives? Why shouldn't holders of these materials just take advantage of the more formalized practices of preservation and access that are available in major institutions, right across the midway here in this institution, for example. And I think at some point, in the past, maybe in the present, these kinds of materials would not have been, or might still not be, of interest to those kinds of institutions, or they might not have been well treated in them, or people who might have given them to major institutions might have felt that they wouldn't be well treated. But actually, increasingly we find librarians and archivists who are themselves politically progressive and have an interest in these kinds of things and would welcome them. So, at that point, like, why not? One kind of concern would be, well, how much can you rely on those personal connections when there are larger institutional logics at work that might cause problems down the road? You can't control what happens once things end up in an institution. There are also some practical benefits I think we see that have to do with scale. So a smaller archive can make connections among materials that might be much harder to make in a bigger institutional archive. So just as there are some good reasons, and there are many other good reasons, to create and maintain independent archives, there are also some particular challenges, which I think we'll hear quite a bit about today. I think one thing about the archives represented by the three speakers who you're about to hear from is that each is based on a set of political assumptions or political goals or goals of survival. They're not neutral. They don't have the sort of neutrality of an institutional archive. But that also kind of raises a question, maybe a sort of existential question about what archives are for. Because I think materials that get archived are really materials that are on the edge between usefulness and uselessness. They're things that the giver is willing to give away, but not to throw away, right? And I think that there's a sort of baseline assumption that things are archived when they outlive their usefulness, when they're, as I said, okay to give away but not to throw out. But that kind of suggests that their only usefulness lies in, their only continuing usefulness is to the scholar, the historian, someone trying to write history. That's not nothing. That's, obviously the writing of history is itself political and itself important. But I think that the archives represented here today also have a more expansive sense of the ongoing usefulness of their materials, not only for the writing of history, but as something that is continuing living, active, like a continuing living, active usefulness, whether it's artistically or politically or in other ways. So how do you keep that usefulness going? How do you keep them in play, even as you are also preserving them? And if usefulness is a criterion, is there some point at which you might decide they're not useful anymore? Is there some point you might decide that your archive isn't useful anymore? And also another question, for artists and activists, why spend your time archiving when you could be being an artist or being an activist? It seems like a question to pose. Like, what is the sort of urgency of archiving for all of us? So that kind of leads me to some sort of nuts and bolts questions, like how do you keep deciding to keep going? Because I think small independent archives face a constant question. It's not assumed that they'll keep going. I mean, I think people want them to, but it's a kind of constant series of decisions. Okay, we are going to keep going. We're going to try to keep raising money. How do you not spend all your time trying to raise money to keep the archive open? How often do you revise your scope? How often do you say, well, we used to accept these kinds of things, but this actually falls outside the scope of the archive now, so we're not going to accept them anymore. And at that point, what do you do with those things that you had previously accepted but you don't accept anymore? So these are just some of the kinds of questions. I know there'll be others, many others, and many other kinds of experiences raised by the speaker. So this was just to sort of put out a few questions to start with. And we'll have multiple opportunities not only to hear from the speakers, but also to have more informal kinds of discussion when these kinds of questions can continue to be raised. So what I'm going to do now is I'll introduce all the speakers in a row, and then have them come up and speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. And once we're all done, we'll all come up and sit here at the table and have a discussion and question and answer from the audience. And we're starting a little bit late, and we're basically planning to go a little bit late. We allowed probably too much time for the unfurling. So what will happen after this will probably go until about 3:30, and then direct you to where we're going to be for the unfurling, which is the performance hall in this same building, which you can get to from either the first floor or the lower level. We'll give more details about that then. And there there'll also be coffee and cookies and pastries, so we'll have a little bit of a break, and then we'll get started with the unfurling, more like sometime between 3:45 and 4. Okay, so I will begin. We're going to go in the order that it appears on the poster. Karen Stanworth is here as a representative of the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, CLGA, in Toronto, Canada, which is the largest community-based queer archives in the world. Karen is senior curator and a director of the board at the CLGA. In her real full-time job, Karen is an associate professor jointly appointed in the Department of Art History and Visual Culture and the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, Canada. She's just completed a manuscript on visual culture entitled Visibly Canadian, which examines the imaging and imagining of social identities through art and popular visual practices in CLGA as a way of communicating her queer scholarly work to the diverse communities that use and live in relation to the archives. She's currently developing a virtual exhibition platform for the CLGA as a means of expanding access to the depths of the archival holdings. The first virtual exhibition draws upon the CLGA's major exhibition in 2012, Public Sins, Private Desires, Tracing Lesbian Lives in the Archives, 1950 to 1980. Chaitra Powell is an archivist who earned her BA degree in sociology from the University of Arizona in 2007 and her MLS degree from the University of Arizona in 2010. She's worked with archival collections in public libraries, medical libraries, government repositories, academic libraries, and corporations. When Chaitra moved to Chicago in July of 2011, she became involved with the Chicago area archivists, volunteered on the history committee at the DuSable Museum, and worked on a photograph processing project at Johnson Publishing Company. Chaitra was placed at the Mayme A. Clayton Library and Museum as a fellow by the History Makers, and in her 9-month residency, she created the finding aid for the 800 linear feet of materials that compose the Dr. Mayme A. Clayton collection of African American history and culture, and co-curated an exhibit, Audio Assault, Sights and Sounds of the Black Power Movement, 1965 to 1975. She'll be discussing the challenges of applying an archival framework to collections in an independent, nonprofit cultural institution. And there's a lot more that I would be able to say about Josh, but he sent me a very brief bio. So Josh MacPhee is a member of the Just Seeds Artist Cooperative and a co-founder of the Interference Archive, a public collection of cultural materials produced by social movements. He's the co-author of Signs of Change, Social Movement Cultures 1960s to Now, and co-editor of Signal, a journal of international political graphics and culture. He also designs books as part of the collaborative design firm called Antumbra. So, without further ado, Karen.
Thanks, Rebecca. Just give me a second or two just to open Bob. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about the CLGA, the Canadian Lesbian Gay Archives. This is our 40th anniversary this year. I've been actively involved with the archives for 2 years, I'm a member of the board and senior curator and dog's body when it comes to exhibitions. Pretty much do everything around archival-based exhibitions with my interns. In fact, at 3:15 today, I have to send in some press release and photographic request material. So it's kind of crazy, but that's partly, I guess, what we like about it, because it's really hands-on and we have an actual chance to do something, which I think really makes a big difference. So Gay Premises is actually the name of our next exhibition. Gay Premises, Radical Voices in the Archives, 1973 to 1983. It's our Pride exhibition, which will be opening June 14th. I'm not going to actually tell you about that show. I'm going to tell you how we got to that. So Rebecca asked me to talk about the nitty-gritty of the archive. Given that the archive has survived 40 years, there's a lot of nits and grits. This is the first newspaper that was produced called The Body Politic. It was specifically produced as a political response to Stonewall and to acts of repression in Canada, which started pretty much simultaneously with Stonewall. And a bunch of young people got together and decided they needed to do something to protest and record what was happening. And so The Body Politic was produced, the first issue in 1971 for 25 cents. And some of these young gay guys, mostly, would take the newspaper around the bars and sell it for 25 cents. That would be in a day when draft beer was 20 cents, so you can see it would have been a lot to cough up. So it began as a radical tabloid, I interviewed Ed Jackman not so long ago, and he was talking to me about how founding of The Body Politic as a tangible piece of material was critical to establishing place, so that to actually say we're here, we're visible, we're queer. I'm kind of emotional about this. Especially since Ed, who I interviewed 2 weeks ago, has been involved with The Body Politic and the archives since 1973. So we have a longevity, and then we have also a newness in the archival body. Let's see how we go. Okay, so originally the archive was formed about 1973. It's a little unclear because what they called the archive in those days was basically a cardboard box. And it was, you know, it starts somewhere. It was a cardboard box, but people like to say it started with a filing cabinet. There's something kind of tidier about that. So Rick Bebu, in writing the inventory of The Body Politic in 1978, started to talk about organizing the papers of the body politic. So it starts with this move to collect the object itself that was produced in order to collect ideas about the movement. So we have this intimate relationship with the body politic. And I put some of this type in, obviously you don't have to read it. It's just to sort of show this kind of self-awareness, and awareness that what they were doing was collecting themselves. For example, from 1975 until 1980, the archives was formally part of Pink Triangle Press. And for all of its existence, but for a brief stay in the house of its founder, Ron Damon, it has shared premises with the Body Politic or the press. This has changed and shifted over the years. But in looking at the archive of the archives, particularly for this exhibition and for this show, I thought it was important to bring forward how the archive was handled and manipulated over time, how it moves from this box to now being truly the largest community-based queer archives. And all of those adjectives matter because there's other community-based queer archives, but then they're institutionally located, or there's institutional archives that are larger than ours, but it's that combination of elements which is pretty critical to us. So, this is the piece that I don't know why it doesn't show up here. I'm not super good at this stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you this. This has come from, this is a moment of deciding you're going to archive. So about 2 years after the body politic is founded. The task of reconstructing the history of gay people is painstaking work, often yielding little more than speculative sketches of what has been done. Here you can put, instead of gay people, any of those causes. History can be a tool of oppression and liberation. It has all too often reflected the worldview of status quo, projecting the historian's own political, moral, and psychological biases onto reality, rarely providing an objective and neutral account of the real people and forces involved. These straight historians, here the anger building, and other guardians of morality, have been very conscientious in their near obliteration of gay history. One way to encourage accurate historical research is to gather and make available resource material relevant to all aspects of gay history. To this end, the body politic has founded the Canadian GLM Archives. What's interesting to me is that even in their self-fury and representation, they put GLM as initials. The first 2 years of the archives, it was called the Canadian Gay Liberation Movement Archives. And I think the liberation movement is what the exhibition is about, and what I'm trying to do in recovering the moment of founding of the archive is not to put those in letters, but to actually say it out loud. So as a queer historian, I can talk about gay liberation as a specifically historical moment in which there was this self-consciousness about collecting that history and articulating it. This was the first masthead of the archives, the Canadian Liberation Movement Archives, which quickly became the Canadian Gay Archives. So it was known as the CGA for a long time, so they decided to, tokenly represent the lesbians. And now it's the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, and then people say, what are you going to put trans in? I said, well, probably not, because I don't think we'd stand any more initials. It is just what it is. And what we're doing now is changing how people understand what CLGA means. But on the way to now, it starts out, for example, on a 5th floor walk-up. This was on Duncan Street, and the body politic offices were this way, that way, and then behind them was the archives. So there was really no separation except by sometimes fake walls, sometimes bookshelves. Really the two institutions were feeding in and off each other. And the critical thing for the archives is that they set up an exchange network amongst other gay liberation newspapers. And so I was interviewing Jean Cordova from Los Angeles about founding of the Lesbian Tide. And so I said, well, how come you wrote for the body politic? Here people think of it as a gay white guy's place. And why would, a Latina liberationist separatist be writing for us? And so she said, well, because we thought it was reliable, it was printed, and it was politically in my ballpark. And so what happened was when this network got set up, this exchange, there would be free copies that would be mailed to different archives at the time. So really that box, the original box, was the material from other archives, other newspapers, other activists. And it was material that started piling up. And it piled up in the back of the Glad Day bookstore, which was all in a collective house, because everybody lived collectively in the 70s. So in the back of the collective were all these boxes. And one night, Ron Damon, the guy's credited with founding the archive, he actually went in and stole the boxes, because he didn't like the guy who was running the bookstore. So in a totally collective manner, the next meeting that they had, they voted the guy from the bookstore off the collective. So Ron Damon's credited with saving the boxes. I haven't really been able to find out the story because, unfortunately, in our communities, a lot of men did not survive the 80s and 90s. So Ron Damon's not someone I can ask, nor is Gerald Logan Howard, nor are most of the other men who were involved, unfortunately. But there is, again, this self-consciousness about keeping this material and where does it come from. So I think it's important, and as Jean said, what happened was we established our own kind of internet. We were exchanging information, we were clipping from each other, we were cutting out the news, we were reproducing the news, we were stealing each other's articles, sometimes we got credited. You know, sometimes it was collected and we assumed the information belonged to everybody, but we took this material and we collected it, and we talked about each other, and we talked to each other. Across North America, into the US, into Mexico. I have a letter from a man in Brazil who writes, and he says, "We are so happy that you're sending us the body politic. Unfortunately, our Brazilian gay news," or whatever the title was, "folded. However, we're still in the house, so please send it to me at," and he gave this address. And so this is a long letter about how wonderfully you've reprinted your articles. We really appreciate it. We sometimes have trouble translating it, but we're pretty good. And then he says, "And I've included a photo of myself." I don't know why, it's a photo of him in his underwear. That'll be in the exhibit. So over the years, we went from a basement to a house. Rescued or stolen, this is the story of Ron Damon, the boxes belonging to the nascent Canadian Gay Liberation Archives. He stores them in the basement. About a year later, they returned, and they went to this shared living space, now the Canadian Gay Archives. And CLGA moved many times over the years. It moved 5 times, but the most significant move was when it moved into its own space. At that point, it had to become financially sustainable. So the Archives was forced to raise more money than ever before, and that perhaps was the most critical moment, a moment of independence and recognition. So you have this sort of energy of the first 5 to 8 years, and then there's this moment of, okay, and this goes back to what Rebecca said, well, why are we doing this? Are we going to continue, and how are we going to continue? So it was mostly based on volunteer labor throughout the years. We still have that map cabinet, which now stores our posters. I met Joan, a young woman there, the other night at a fundraiser or something. And we were just talking about that moment of collaboration, and she considers herself an ally. She's not gay, doesn't identify as queer, but has been involved in the archives for many, many years, just as in a supportive role. So we've many allies, which is part of a very important aspect of survival, was the allies. People who cared enough to stand up. So in response to Rebecca's request for the nitty-gritty, I'm going to talk about the difficulties experienced by smaller archives, which actually were nicely articulated in a brief to the Canada Council. I consulted a group on the Canadian Archives in 1977. So this is what they identified as the difficulties for smaller archives. Hard to get professional help. Heavy reliance on volunteer labor, new technology beyond their financial needs. Small archives are often reliant on low-budget institutions themselves, so that if you find an ally, that ally is often broke. Lack of proper security and fire protection, ongoing issue. What would happen if the basement had flooded? What would happen if there was a fire? In terms of the gay archives, there was another level of security issue, which I'll talk about in a minute. Unable to pursue special projects due, again, to lack of money or equipment. And lack of a vehicle to reach out to potential supporters. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that was resolved. Some of the specific problems that were articulated in the same brief. As a small but national archives, a great deal of energy is expended making contact with more than 90 organizations across the country, many of whom are small or short-lived. So we would have, like, the Edmonton Gay News or the Alberta Lesbian Movement archives, and it would last like 2 months. There was the Sudbury Gay News. I think they all call themselves Gay Community News or Community News. But they would be short-lived or long-lived, or it would be really hard to connect. And that's exactly the point, is that it's the interconnections between the different groups that are responding politically to what was going on at the moment, and how did we create this body of knowledge that could then be shared and saved and protected. Again, the Canadian Gay Archives relies entirely on volunteer labor. Fortunately, they had professional help in the early stages. Basically, after they were able to reconstitute the archive, they were able to call in a bunch of young queer activists who also happened to be doing their, masters in library science or were archivists. And so they had a small core of 5 or 6 professionals to help them get through the next few years. The archives relies on a press, so in relying on this other institution, which itself was constantly going broke, there was no ongoing funding. Still a problem. Danger from fire and vandalism, and plans to microfilm were delayed for about 10 years until somebody gave them money to buy the microfilm. They also permanently shelved the oral history program. It's very sad. Major themes in the first 10 years. These are the things I'm going to speak to for the next 5 or so minutes. Survival, which is fear of fire and vandalism, but also fear of obliteration. A desire for legitimization, desire for recognition as an archive and as a valuable future resource. This is a major issue for the Canadian Gay Archives because this is about that who cares kind of question. Who cares whether this stuff survives? And so the desire for legitimacy was really important. And institutionalization. Concerns about institutionalization, what did it mean, especially for gay archives to be institutionalized? Mixed feelings. It's interesting because in going through the archive, it became clear to me that initially they really did expect that the gay movement archives would be recognized as having captured the gay liberation movement, and it would be seen as valuable as, say, the women's liberation movement, which had been permanently accessioned by one of the government's provincial bodies. And so there was this kind of pull-push between the some of the members of the collective who thought they should be institutionalized and some who thought this would threaten their mandate, which again Rebecca talked to a little bit. And now, 40 years later, we're still having, I guess not the same question, but it's pretty much the same issue. Is how do we think about what we take and what we don't take? How do we think about records management, basically? Which is, when I use those 2 words, it's almost like I'm swearing. They really do not want to think about records management because they really want to think of themselves as taking everything that matters to the Canadian liberation movement, and it's impossible. So, survival. Ed Jackson used the terms obliteration, which was a very real fear, given that from the early mid-70s, the body politic was constantly being raided. Sometimes they took stuff, the police, the morality squad took stuff, sometimes they didn't take stuff, sometimes members of the collective were up on obscenity charges. Of course, the collective would republish the thing that they just got off on, and then they would again get charged. Because it was about freedom of speech. It wasn't about whatever sexual liberation thing was being talked about. So for example, this is text that I've just taken from the body politic to give you an idea of how they would report what was happening to themselves. So this is constant reportage back and forth, and then this would go to other newspapers and journals across North America, England, Australia, as a way of creating a following and trying to get people to contribute to the defense fund. Moves to legitimization. So they set up a gay community, National Gay Community Archives, as a way of then saying, well, we are a legitimate archival association, which I think is rather clever. They also created the Gay Archivist as a way of actually writing the history of the archives. The name change was done purposefully in order to get rid of the difficult-to-swallow liberation movement wording. Actually, to try to depoliticize at the same time they talk about it being a political institution. Publications by various members in archival associations, and participation in the National Gay Archive. Lots of talk about the structure. Here's the concerns re-institutionalization. Is it good to get out of a storefront? Is it good to get out of sight or not? Maybe we get someone else to do the mind-numbing work. But, grave concern about surrendering our history. Are we willing to give up control? Plus the scope. We're probably all going to mention this stuff, but since I'm going first, you can all skip through your slides on this. The one thing that is uniquely Canadian is the notion of a total archives. And so, in Canadian archival history, since the 19th century, there has always been an attitude that you collect the personal and the governmental. We do not separate, and our National Archives does not have only the kind of material that would be in your National Archives. We have an art collection, there is an ephemera collection, there are objects in that collection. So that has changed and affected how the archives exist. So the 4 tenets are that archivists should document the history of all Canadian society, not just the elite. They should acquire all kinds of material. They should control the entire life cycle of the records. So records management is a really big question. And archivists should create archival records. Last couple of minutes, I'm just going to give you a little color of what we actually hold. Artifacts, artwork, audio, books, living images, National Portrait Collection, periodicals, posters, vertical files. In terms of the artifacts, they've been collected since the 70s. You can see Series 26 was an archives with an extent of 38 meters, about 109 feet. That's the only piece of the archives that's now missing. Apparently, our missing is a body politic mascot of the late 70s, a tiny wind-up robot which, when knocked down, flails around for a bit and then slowly stands itself back up. That's pretty much the story of the archives. I know Rebecca wants me to stop, but I could just show you some of the types of things we have. Ephemera, clipping, serials, posters, handmade posters, art objects, photographs of activism, and then ending with, this is the facilities today. We are now in a house. We call it the house. And the collective still lives there. We joke about having cots underneath the desks. This is downtown, about 5 minutes from my house. So I'm going to end there. I have lots of other material we can talk about in terms of what we're doing today in the forms of exhibition programming and outreach. We work with artists to intervene and examine our collection through our exhibition programming. We do roundtables, talkbacks, calls, all sorts of stuff. But maybe we can talk a little bit about that later. Okay? Thank you.
My name is Chaitra Powell, and I'm going to be talking about the Mayme Clayton Library and Museum. This presentation, Defining an Archive at the Mayme Clayton Library and Museum, because you can see archives is not in our title, but I'm hoping to show you how we do collect archives and what we do to show our relevance in our community. Before I get started in my remarks, I do have some footage of Dr. Clayton and her collection, which began in her home in Los Angeles. So we can look at that for a couple of minutes, and then I'll talk more about who she was as an individual.
Chaitra. If you go to that, yeah, there you go.
I've been a book collector and known everywhere, so people just send me a list and say, are you interested in this, that, and other? If I have the money, I say yes. But I have to pay for it, you know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, now this is a signed copy of W.B. Du Bois.
Wow. Great.
Yeah, and this is Martin Luther King, signed copy.
Wow.
You like that, huh?
Yeah.
This is a signed copy of Zora Neale Hurston. You remember her? She was a famous writer back in the late 20s and 30s.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And this is Langston Hughes.
Whoa. Okay.
So all of these books in this section are signed copies. And we have a lot of those.
I see.
And this was the first Ebony magazine that ever came out.
Is that right?
Yeah, volume 1, number 1. Came out in November.
25 cents.
Yeah, 1945.
Wow.
And you know, John Johnson had somebody call me to see if I had volume 1, number 1. And I said, yeah, I'm going to keep it too. Because I'm afraid if I let you even borrow it, I may not get it back, you know.
Right.
And he'd rather just pay me whatever I want to get the copy.
Wow.
But it's amazing the stuff that he had in here.
That's something.
Yeah. Yeah.
It goes on and on. It's really exciting because I was a part of a fellowship program here in Chicago, and my placement was at the Mayme Clayton Library and Museum, so I hadn't heard of it until I learned about this fellowship. And this woman collected a large amount of materials about African American history and culture in her home in the West Adams district of Los Angeles. It's a 3-bedroom house. She had 3 kids and a husband, and she still managed to amass over 2 million items related to African American history and culture. So I will talk a little bit about what that looks like today. So this is Dr. Clayton. She was born in Van Buren, Arkansas in 1923. Of course, there wasn't very much information about positive contributions of African Americans at that time. So she really made it her life's ambition to collect every piece of material that demonstrated that simple concept. When I started working on the collection, my task was to go through her papers, which was about 160 boxes of materials related to her outreach, the organizations that she started. She started the Western States Black Research Center, where people could come to her home, look at the materials for their research. One of the most famous researchers who worked with her was Alex Haley when he was working on Roots. He spent some time in Mayme's collection. She also started the Black American Cinema Society, where she gave tribute to African American filmmakers and actors from the as early as the 1940s. She has a lot of Oscar Micheaux movies and movie posters. And then the third organization that she owned was the Third World Ethnic Books, which was a wholesale book retailer out of her garage. So she would sell books to libraries and schools from diverse authors and about diverse topics. So she was very dynamic. She did all of this in her lifetime. She passed away in 2006. But even prior to that, her and her family were concerned about the longevity of the collection and what would happen to it when she wasn't here to take care of it. Also, as you could kind of see from that footage, it's a very precarious setup. The way when the camera spans, you see books just piled on top of each other, newspapers stacked and mildewing. It was getting to be very susceptible to fires, floods, and damages. So her oldest son, Avery, actually took the mantle probably in the late 90s to try to find a permanent home for the collection. And that's actually how we secured a decommissioned courthouse in Culver City, California. So the court went out of business in 2006 and we moved in. Actually, in the week before Dr. Clayton died, we found out we secured that location. So it's a really great ending to her lifetime's work of collecting these materials. The courthouse is a great space. It's about 42,000 square feet of space for us that we've been able to use for collection storage and exhibits. We still have a lot of work to do as far as making it or adapting it to archival standards. So we'll go through it. But I just wanted to give you a sampling of what she collected. It's altogether 14 series. Her papers are one, her manuscripts. She has a large sheet music collection. She has over 700 films, which are currently stored at UCLA in cold storage, just because we don't have the facilities to properly maintain it right now. And so they're just on deposit there, and we can access them whenever we need to. She also has posters. She loved the movies, so we have a lot of lobby cards and full movie posters. Books are really the majority of our collection. Her inventory for third world ethnic books is essentially our book collection right now. So there's about 10,000 books in the collection. Those are from the general collection, and then we have a rare books collection, which are the pre-1945 books that are autographed or were published before 1945. She also has cultural artifacts series, audio recordings, visual art, pamphlets, brochures, and ephemera, as well as serials. We collect newspapers, magazines. We have a really cool collection of Panther papers from the Black Panther Party. We also have Muhammad Speaks, some of those papers from the Muslim movement. And then she also has a large scrapbook collection. So those are the 14 that compose Mayme's collection, but now that we've been open as a repository, different people have also deposited their materials with us. So that is the scope of the museum. I'm explaining to decommissioned courthouse. Community repository, we've gotten some really interesting things since we've been open. We do have a Black LGBT collection, which is really unique because some of you might be familiar at USC, which is right down the street from us. They have a queer archives called The One. But this particular donor was interested in the way that we are a community archives. You don't have to be a scholar or a student to access our materials. And so he made the conscious choice to bring his materials to us there at the Mayme Clayton. We also have some materials from significant California politicians. Mervyn Dimely was a congressman, and Diane Watson also gave us some of their materials. Also, as an independent archive, we're always trying to show our relevance, and so we do so much public programming, and we give tours. We give tours every day at 11 and 2, and we walk people through the collection, and we show them some of our current exhibitions. Right now, we have Remembering Westbrook, which is the acronym for Mayme's research institution, so it's the Western States Black Research Center. And that's basically where we give homage to Mayme. We give a sampling of the collection. We actually put up wood paneling to mimic her garage, so people know what they're walking into when they come into the courthouse. Audio Assault, which Rebecca alluded to in the beginning, this was something I co-curated. This is an exhibit about the Black Power movement. It's really unique because we use records. We use vinyl to demonstrate the issues of the time. So there'll be a picture, or there'll be a record from John Coltrane, and then it'll show. It's featuring Alabama, and then we'll talk about the 4 little girls in Birmingham and how the music was responding to the issues of the time. We also talk a little bit about the Watts riots in 1965 and the Watts Stacks concert in 1972 as kind of this resurgence of community upliftment, pride and heritage, and and just moving forward with this more pro-Black movement. We talked about how popular music, spoken word, and jazz artists were also responding to the issues of the time. So Audio Assault is really exciting, and we have some listening stations also so people can hear the music and learn about those events. We have an art collection on deposit, Jacob Lawrence, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. We have a collector who deposited some of his pieces, and we have them on display in the courthouse. And then we also have the Lemur Park photo exhibition. Lemur Park is kind of an artistic enclave in LA, and we feature some of those photographers and artists. So that's what's going on right now. It's pretty good. The suggested donation is $10, and people will just come through and see what we're doing over there. So that's one way that we raise money. Like I was saying earlier, and I always go around and around with my executive director about this because I really want to see the archive thrive and process collections and be open to researchers, but it's so critical that we are open to the public and that we do public programming. So even though we are a library and a museum, the reason the collection should be organized like an archive is because we don't do too many exhibit material loans. Most of the materials are primary source documents, and they're mostly two-dimensional information artifacts. And when people do donate to us, we do collect deeds and gifts. So it's very much an archive. It's just that we are always demonstrating the relevance of materials within the collection. So when I got there, one of my biggest concerns, I was working in Mayme's papers, but I couldn't really get a bead on how things were organized. And so after talking to people who had known Mayme, getting a feel for volunteers who had been working there for years and years, I got the sense that we needed to kind of set a baseline of how we collect things and what we do with them once they get here. So the first thing I did was I came up with some collection guidelines and a flow chart. This is a generic one just to give you a visual, but what I did was essentially think about the museum as library collections versus archive collections. So if someone is just going to drop off a book that's already been published, Mayme probably already has it in her collection, then we would accession it as a library material and check it for a duplicate. If it is, it could be deaccessioned. If it's not, it will increase our library collection. Same thing for magazines. When we take people on tours, they see all these jets and they're like, oh, my grandma has a bunch of jets at her house, can we bring them in? We have to tell them, no, we already have enough jet magazines, and we don't need to continue to add those to our collection. And so the library materials keep growing, but the archive materials are stagnant. So when Mervyn Diamond brought his collection, that was an archive. We generated a finding aid for it and we processed it that way. And it seems really simple, but it was kind of difficult to get people to understand the difference so that we could move forward as an organization, as opposed to just, it would never end if we just kept everything that people dropped off. So I think that we're going to be a lot more discerning about what we accession going forward. And then having the flow chart also helped us figure out exactly what happens when things come into the building. So I think that was one of the challenges when we started out. Everybody was just excited to come in there and start working on Mayme's collection and collect everything that came through the door. But it really, we needed some baseline standards going forward. So that was one way that we dealt with the innate situation and put in some structure. Another thing that we talked about earlier was having reduced staff. We try to combat that with student interns. We have great relationships with UCLA. They have a library school there, so they send us students all the time. And it's really my conversations with those students that help me kind of identify what we should be doing going forward and moving forward in kind of a standardized way. Because it's really important that we adapt the standards of archives as far as uploading our collections, being a part of the conversations. So with a limited paid staff, the graduate student interns have been a great asset to us. We also have a large volunteer corps. Volunteers really keep us going. A lot of people knew Mayme, they knew about the garage, and so they're really committed to our project. One thing that we did is that we are very liberal in the volunteers that we accept. Anybody who's interested, we encourage them to come on down and start processing the collection. And it can kind of backfire sometimes because not everybody's an archivist, not everybody has great attention to detail, and sometimes you wind up doing the work over and over again because people aren't properly trained. So to combat that, we do quarterly volunteer trainings. I recently facilitated one where I told them about DATS, Describing Archives, a content standard. I showed them what extent meant, what scope of content is for, what a container list is about. And so I think giving them, because a lot of times we just send people in to do inventories, but letting them know that this inventory is a part of a finding aid which can be published so people can come and know more about what we're doing was really critical. So I'm glad I had that opportunity. It really sparked a lot of interest, and I think going forward we'll have a lot more concentrated and good work coming out of our volunteers, and really focusing their energy instead of sending them on these wild goose chases to just do random things. So the volunteer is important, but you have to train them. Another problem that I encountered when I started working there is that people were generating inventories in all different computers all over the museum, and it was very challenging because nobody knew what the most current version was. And so another thing that's really simple, but you've really got to get people on the same page to move forward in a concentrated way. So now we have our entire collection on Google Drive. There's folders for every collection. There's the updated inventories are always there. It's great for me because as the volunteers are working, I can check in, looking at the documents in real time, and editing them along the way. We also use Google Drive because we lack a large technological infrastructure. We don't have a server, so we don't really have a centralized place to put all of our materials. One challenge is that we don't have the internet throughout the building, and so sometimes we have to move the collections to the processing space and then take them back. But overall, that's a better situation than running around with jump drives and internal hard drives trying to collect all of these documents. So it really worked out quite well now that we're using Google Drive. We're still shopping for an internal database that we can use to access our materials and catalog them in a centralized place that's more geared towards information centers. But in the meantime, at least our data is supposedly safe in the cloud. So that was a great solution for us. Another thing is that we didn't really have strategic planning as far as which collections we should focus on. And so even before I got there, we established a collection advisory board. And this is a group of people who give us advice on the collection. They also share with us their research goals, and we determine what parts of our collection would really benefit them, and we focus on those. And so right now, our collection advisory board features faculty at UCLA and also at Cal State Northridge. We even have Jacqueline Stewart, who's faculty at Northwestern University. She's on our collection advisory board. And it was them who really, because we had been working on Mayme's papers, but in some months we do some Stevie Cannon jazz record stuff, and in other months we work on the LGBT collection. So it was really important for us to centralize our efforts, and they guide us along the way. Sometimes you can't really see the forest for the trees when you're working on these things. So having an outside point of view that have your best interests at heart is really helpful. That's also been a great network for us. The next project that they're going to be helping us with is a researcher symposium where we'll actually pull materials out of our collection and let scholars know that we're open and that they can do research at the museum. As I was saying before, we don't have a centralized database, and even on our website you can't really search our collections. And so we're really fortunate to be in the state of California where there is this online Archives of California. I don't know if you've all heard of it. A lot of states are getting them, and there are these repositories. It's a collaboration between the UC schools and the California Digital Library, where they encourage small archives and historical societies to upload their collection information, and you'll be searchable. And it's really important that we get on there, because if you search right now for Mayme Clayton, nothing will come up. Nobody will know about this individual who had such a great contribution in Southern California. So I've been talking with them. They're really pushing Archivist Toolkit. They will help us install it, and a lot of the uploads are compatible with Archivist Toolkit, but they will also work with anybody, so or with any software. So that is really a huge goal of ours. And as my fellowship is over, I'm moving into a consultant capacity for the museum, and this will be my primary objective, is to get as many of our collections online for people going forward. So those are some of our solutions, because it's really easy to talk about how we don't have money and staff, and it's really hard to keep going, but if you're resourceful and if you really work hard, you can get this stuff off the ground. We do have a lot of work to do. Fundraising is always an issue. We do not have any state or federal funding. It's only grants that we get and donations. We do have a membership program, and that helps a little bit. But it is a struggle, so we're always working on fundraising. We need to increase our volunteer recruitment and structure so we can get more people in the door to help us move along. We need to shop in our database. The internship structure is about the same that we could use, even undergrads in history and education, to help us with our public programming. It would be great to increase, especially since there's so many schools in Southern California, and we have a lot of people to choose from, so let's bring them in. Also, like in the court, it's a courtroom space, and we have kept the actual courtroom, so sometimes we get funding from movie studios that film in there. If you've seen that movie Lincoln Lawyer with Matthew McConaughey, it was filmed. And I was like, I would have brought images, but it's really hard to make out exactly what it is until you're in there. And then we also have a jail space, which is kind of cool for sometimes when we do like civil rights programming and with kids, and they'll get arrested for nonviolent protests, and they'll be booked with their fingerprints and their height measured in the jail space, and they'll sing freedom songs in the jail. So, Dr. Clayton, she had no idea that her stuff would end up in a courthouse, but it's really gratuitous in a lot of ways. And we're actually renting the space from the county for $1 a year. So we're very fortunate to have the space. And I think with a little ingenuity and being a lot more proactive as opposed to reactive to the challenges that come our way, I don't think there's any reason why we won't be around for another 40 years. So the museum is going well. We're still trying to adapt the courtroom space. Some rooms get really hot. Some rooms don't have the proper shelving. Materials are still in the shabby boxes that they were donated in. So we have a lot of work to do, but I'm definitely inspired and encouraged by Dr. Clayton. I mean, all this time she was collecting in her home with a family to feed. She still managed to do all these things. So, there's no reason why we can't go forward with the resources that we have. So that is pretty much the conclusion. Thank you very much. I'll be around throughout the day so we can talk more about it. Okay. Thank you.
Hi everyone. If you want to stretch for a second, everyone's been sitting down for like an hour. If anyone needs to stand up, feel free. I want to thank Rebecca and Daniel and everyone who helped make this happen. My name again is Josh MacPhee, and I am representing a project I'm involved in called the Interference Archive. And I think that we're definitely the baby of the group. We opened our doors in December of 2011, so we've been around for about a year and a half. And the collection largely grew out of two personal collections, myself and my former partner, Derek Greenwald. I'm actually found that the questions that Rebecca asked at the beginning were often almost word for word the questions that we're asking ourselves, and that a lot of the problems and issues and kinds of things that people collect and everything that's been discussed is pretty close to a lot of the things that we're dealing with. So I'm going to largely deal with some of the broader social concerns that we struggle with and are working with. And then some of the nitty-gritty can maybe get worked out in questions and answers and things like that. We are probably a baby in lots of ways. We're a small 700 square foot space in Gowanus, Brooklyn. It's absolutely not an ideal place for an archive because the Gowanus Canal is a super fun cleanup site. And it's extremely humid and we're sitting almost literally on top of it. So we have dehumidifiers running all the time. But this is sort of how we see our primary functions. We're an archive of movement culture. We do exhibitions and regular events. And we have lots of different kinds of people come in for different reasons to use the materials. And then we also have people that work in the space. And so I pulled out a handful of these things that are the ideas that drive us. And this is basically, we collect what we call social movement culture, which is that when people are organizing to improve their lives, they develop culture that we see as distinct from what often is considered art or just straight politics, and as such often gets lost in the cracks of those two separate disciplines, which is extremely unfortunate but also dangerous because often the culture is very central to the actual transformations that happen in our world. As sort of an illustration of this, we did a project in the fall with a group called the École de la Montagne Rouge, which is a group of design students from Montreal that were one of a very active group of collectives of artists and organizers and activists that were part of the Quebec student strike that took part through most of 2012 and has flared up and down this year as well to oppose tuition hikes and against, to try to maintain a strong Quebecois belief that education is a right that everyone should have access to. And it was really interesting because of about 15 members, 11 of them came and did about a 72-hour intensive kind of residency and installation and project at the archive. And, you know, they were all 18, 19, 20 undergrad design students, all training to learn how to sell hamburgers. And they were really excited, far more excited about the work they were doing with this school they had set up, the Red Mountain School, than their sort of day-to-day design training work. And one of them said something I thought was really interesting, is at the core of why I think we as an archive do what we do, which is that, you know, they're like, sometimes we get encouraged to cooperate with each other in class and things, but it's always in the service of our individual design careers and of the, you know, being able to sell stuff. And that what we get to do here in the École is we get to actually put our services together in a true collective way and use it for the benefit of a much broader sense of collectivity for all the students and all the people that we see that we're working with that are in Quebec and sort of pushing for and driving for a new and different, more socialist Quebec. And so they're actually generating culture not for privatization, not for profit, not for the selling of things, but for solidarity, for mutual aid, for building a society together. And that, I think, is a great definition of what social movement culture is and can be. They came down and put some serious miles on the archive. We're a completely open, I mean, archive in some ways is a misnomer because we have totally open stacks and anyone can come in and pull things out and rummage through it. We don't have any of the sort of boundaries, either philosophically or physically, that a lot of archives have to access. So they came, they actually lived in the space, built this big installation, printed new posters, designed all kinds of work in relationship to the election that was about to happen in Quebec.